You ever have one of those experiences where something just doesn't sit right? Where you know, deep down, that you should have turned around and left but didn't? That's exactly what happened to me last November. I was in Edinburgh for a work trip. I travel a lot for work, so I've gotten used to staying in Airbnbs instead of hotels. It feels more personal, you know. Plus, it's usually cheaper. I found this flat right in the center of the city, perfect location, and the reviews were great. The host, a guy named Thomas, had almost all 5-star ratings. Everyone talked about how clean and cozy the place was, and how helpful Thomas had been. So, I booked it without a second thought. When I got there, it was already evening. The weather was exactly what you'd expect for Edinburgh in November, cold, damp, and with a bit of that bone-chilling wind. The street was narrow, cobblestone, very old world, which I thought was cool at first. The flat was on the 3rd floor of this old building, and the stairs creaked with every step I took. By the time I got to the door, I was looking forward to getting inside and warming up. Thomas had left the key under the mat, just like he said. I let myself in, and as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. The flat was colder than it had any right to be. I figured maybe the heat had been off for a while, so I went to turn the radiators on, but they were already on full blast. I could hear them hissing, but the room didn't warm up. That should have been my first clue to get the hell out of there, but I was tired and just wanted to settle in. The place was odd. Not dirty or anything, but it had this stale, musty smell, like it hadn't been lived in for a long time. The floors were old wood, scuffed and scratched, and there was this big, old fireplace in the living room. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a thick layer of dust on the mantel, but nothing else in the flat seemed dusty, which struck me as weird. I put my bags down and noticed a framed photo on the wall, a black and white shot of Edinburgh's skyline. The picture itself wasn't strange, but there was something about the way it was positioned. It was slightly crooked, like someone had bumped into it and didn't bother to fix it. I went to straighten it out, and that's when I noticed the cold spot. Right in front of the fireplace, the air was icy, like there was a draft, but the windows were all closed. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things. I unpacked, made a cup of tea, and sat down on the couch. The whole time, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too quiet. Even in the middle of the city, I couldn't hear any noise from outside. No cars, no people, nothing. Just this deep, unsettling silence. I figured I'd sleep it off, so I headed to bed early. The bedroom was small, just a bed and a wardrobe, with thick curtains that made the room pitch black when I closed them. I remember lying there, staring up at the ceiling, trying to drift off, but the cold wouldn't go away. I could feel it seeping into the mattress, chilling me to the bone. And then, just as I was about to doze off, I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the living room. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch brushing against the window or maybe the old pipe settling. But it wasn't either of those things. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I lay there, frozen, listening. The sound stopped, and for a few minutes, there was silence again. Then, the floorboards creaked, as if someone was walking around in the living room. I told myself it was just the building settling, old wood expanding and contracting with the temperature. But then, I heard footsteps. Clear, deliberate footsteps, coming closer to the bedroom. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. I just stared at the door, waiting for it to open. But it didn't. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and the handle turned ever so slightly, like someone was testing to see if it was locked. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, too scared to even breathe. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and sunlight was streaming through the curtains. I was out of that flat within 10 minutes, packed my bags and left the key on the kitchen table. I didn't even bother calling Thomas to explain, just sent him a message saying I had to leave early for work. When I got home, I did a bit of digging. Turns out, the building had a bit of history to it. It used to be part of an old tenement that had burned down in the early 1900s. A few people died in the fire, including a man who had been trapped in one of the upper flats. They say he tried to get out but couldn't find the key in time. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or any of that, but I do know one thing: I'll never stay in an Airbnb again without doing my research first. And I'll definitely never go back to that flat in Edinburgh. I've always been drawn to places that are off the beaten path, spots where you can really feel the culture and the history. That's why, when I decided to take a break from work, I booked a small villa in Ubud, Bali. The pictures showed a beautiful place, surrounded by rice paddies, with traditional Balinese architecture. It looked like the perfect spot to unwind and escape the hustle of Jakarta. The villa was listed on Airbnb by a woman named Wayan. Her profile picture showed a warm smile, and all the reviews mentioned how welcoming and helpful she was. The only downside, according to some reviews, was that the place felt a bit isolated, especially at night. That didn't bother me, though. In fact, it was exactly what I was looking for. I arrived in Ubud on a Friday afternoon. Wayan had arranged for a driver to pick me up from the airport, and after an hour's drive through winding roads and lush greenery, we reached the villa. It was even more beautiful in person: wooden beams, intricately carved doors, and an open-air living room that looked out onto a small pool. The entire property was surrounded by thick jungle, with no other houses in sight. Wayan met me at the entrance, her smile just as kind as in her photo. She showed me around, explaining how everything worked. The villa was more traditional than modern, with no TV or Wi-Fi, but that was fine by me. I wanted to disconnect. She gave me her number and told me to call if I needed anything, then left me to settle in. The first evening was peaceful. I watched the sun set over the rice fields, the sky turning shades of orange and pink. As night fell, the sounds of the jungle came alive: crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant calls of birds. It was serene, exactly what I'd hoped for. But as the night grew darker, a different feeling began to creep in. The villa was lit by a few dim lamps, casting long shadows on the walls. I started noticing how quiet it was, too quiet. The usual sounds of nightlife, the chatter of people, the hum of traffic, were absent. Instead, there was just the jungle, pressing in from all sides. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar setting. I went to bed early, thinking a good night's sleep would do me good. But as I lay there, the feeling only intensified. The bed was comfortable, but the room felt wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it. A faint sound, like something tapping on glass. I froze, my heart pounding. The windows in the bedroom were covered with thin curtains, but I could see the outline of something moving outside. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I sat up, trying to convince myself it was just a branch or an animal. But the sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, purposeful. Tap, tap, tap. Gathering my courage, I got out of bed and walked slowly to the window. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled the curtain aside. There was nothing there. Just darkness and the faint outline of the jungle. I breathed a sigh of relief, trying to laugh it off as my imagination running wild. But as I turned back towards the bed, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the room, a shadow, darker than the rest, lingering just out of reach of the light. It was only there for a second, then gone. I blinked, thinking I must have imagined it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the wooden beams, every rustle of the leaves outside, kept me on edge. I was exhausted by morning, but I tried to brush it off as just a rough first night. The next day, I went into town, hoping to distract myself. Ubud was lively, full of tourists and locals, the air filled with the scent of incense and the sound of gamelan music. It helped, for a while, to be around people. But as the day wore on, I started dreading the thought of going back to the villa. When I returned in the late afternoon, Wei Yin was waiting for me at the entrance. She asked how my stay was going, and I tried to play it off like everything was fine. But she must have seen something in my face because she hesitated before speaking. "There's something I should tell you," she said, her voice lower than before. "This villa, it has a history. My family built it generations ago, but it's always been sensitive." "Sensitive?" I asked, not sure what she meant. "There are spirits here. Most of the time, they're peaceful. But they don't like it when people are disrespectful or bring bad energy." I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't done anything disrespectful, had I? They're old spirits, from before my family even settled here. We've learned to live with them, but sometimes, they make themselves known. That night, I tried to put Wei Yin's words out of my mind, but it was impossible. The villa, which had seemed so beautiful and peaceful in the daylight, now felt oppressive. The jungle that had felt so alive now seemed like it was hiding something. I went to bed, leaving the lights on this time, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight, I heard the tapping again, this time louder, more insistent. I stayed in bed, too scared to move. Then came the footsteps, slow, heavy, and unmistakable, moving through the living room. I listened as they got closer, stopping just outside the bedroom door. I held my breath, waiting. The door creaked open, just an inch, but enough for the cold air to rush in. I could feel it, whatever it was, standing just outside, watching. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, eyes fixed on the door, praying for morning. When the first light of dawn finally filtered through the curtains, I packed my bags and left. I didn't bother to call Wei Yin, just sent her a message saying I had to leave early. As I drove away, the villa disappeared into the jungle behind me. I've never gone back to Ubud since, and I don't think I ever will. That place, with its beautiful views and perfect isolation, hides something dark. And whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting.